I recently finished Jedi Survivor and wow, what a game, what a story. This is Star Wars at some of its finest. Thoroughly enjoyed the game, I thoroughly enjoyed the story. There were key moments where I was losing my mind. But that's not to say that the game doesn't have its problems. With the launch being plagued with performance issues as well as just frequent crashes for everyone, whether it be on console or a lot of it seems to be on PC, the game definitely has its flaws. So here's my review of Jedi Survivor. Let's start with the story. Jedi Survivor takes place 5 years after the events of Fallen Order, and obviously the Mantis crew has some catching up to do, as it appears that they have split off at different moments in between the first and second game. Some of these events were described in the Battle Scars book, which I haven't actually read, but I've read up on a synopsis of the story and got the general gist. So a lot of the references to Grease losing his arm and all these other things, I did somewhat understand to some extent. Cal is still on his mission to fight the Empire, get rid of it, and work towards a future that will see the galaxy safe and that the Jedi can return. The introduction was a really good sequence to get you back into the game, get used to the gameplay again, get used to Cal, who's now actually pretty strong in the Force and with his lightsaber. These last 5 years, he's obviously been training hard. Sia's obviously given him some training, which we get some flashbacks of in the story, and the combat just feels so satisfying because of that. Throughout the story, Cal will go on this journey to find a potential new home for him and the Mantis crew and those that he wants to keep safe, whilst also dealing with his own struggles to fight the Empire, his role in all this, and his role as a Jedi as a whole. Now, I'm obviously not going to get into spoilers, but there were some events during this story which blew my mind. Some characters popped up that I didn't expect to see. There were reveals that were just so satisfying, plot twists that I did not see coming, but there were definitely some flaws with the story. The actual main objective of where Cal wants to make a new home, I thought that whole idea in that planet was a little underwhelming. I wasn't too keen on that plot point, but there were other plot points and characters that were sort of making this story. The story of Jedi Survivor, I think, thrives on characters, and that made the story way more satisfying than it would have been if the characters were about as average as the main story was. Now, obviously, there's some side quests and side stories that you can do in Jedi Survivor that sort of fills out the story a lot more and describes different events in the galaxy. Obviously, this is set 10 years after the fall of the Jedi. This is set around the same time that Kenobi was set. So I was expecting to see a few more references. There was one slight reference to Kenobi, at least an organization that is in Kenobi, which I thought was a very satisfying reference to that show. But I did expect a few more little tidbits and sort of events. But we still got plenty of Star Wars lore, plenty of stuff to go on. And overall, it was a really nice Star Wars story, condensed into its own thing where it didn't really feel like it interfered with anything else to do with Star Wars. And again, obviously, I'm trying not to give too much away, but the ending, I don't know how I feel about it. There's a certain key point in the game where the momentum changes. That key moment was where I thought the game was going to end, but the game just kept going, and that made the actual end sequence of the game feel a little slow. I still think that it sets up nicely for a potential third game, which obviously Respawn have said they want to make this into a trilogy. That's the idea with the Jedi series, is that they will make a trilogy out of it, hopefully. And I think the ending of this game obviously does set that up very nicely for a third game, but the overall main story of Survivor, how it all ends up, left me a little bit like, I'd say I give the story an 8 out of 10, honestly. It was pretty good. The characters are what made this, but the actual main story was a little underwhelming in some sections, especially sort of that slower pace towards the end. Now, gameplay, this far surpasses anything Fallen Order made. Gameplay was so good. Everything felt more fluid. Combat was more satisfying. The sound design was something that I noted instantly, which I was like, why aren't more people talking about the sound design of Jedi Survivor and how developed it is, especially compared to Fallen Order? The lightsaber hits, the sound design of each of the different colors of the lightsaber are different. just the general atmosphere and feel of the gameplay. It just, everything came together to make a really satisfying gameplay experience. The game was challenging enough on Jedi Knight difficulty, which I played on, to the point where I wasn't getting overly frustrated, but there were definitely some moments where I was being challenged, and I was satisfied with that challenge. Some of the bosses could have been a little harder maybe in terms of difficulty, because there were some that were like, okay, this is just, you know, copy paste of the moveset from this boss or that boss. And there was a certain boss in the game that actually was repeated, and I don't know how I feel about that. It's not uncommon for games to do boss fights or a certain boss multiple times in a game. Usually the ideal number is twice. You'll fight them once as sort of an opener into that character and that enemy that you'll be obviously fighting throughout the game, and then you'll fight them a second time later in the story where it's a bit more climactic. Jedi Survivor has that, but again, there was just something underlying that felt like, okay, I've done this already. It's a little underwhelming come the third time. World design was immense. Koboh was huge, and like there were different biomes and different feels, different creatures, to the point where it wasn't just that one note planet that Star Wars is sort of known to have. You know, with Jeddah being only a sand planet, we have that one note planet, and Coruscant being a city planet, so it's all metropolis. Koboh wasn't that. Koboh had different biomes, it had a different feel, it had different areas to make it feel quite different whenever you explored the world of Koboh. Customization in this game was actually the one thing I was arguably the most excited for, and boy did it deliver. I spent way too much time designing lightsabers, blasters, how Cal looked with his beard, with his hair, the color of his robes, the color of his leggings, what type of leggings he had. All of this was just so good. I eventually came by the end of the game to a look that I was satisfied with, and I kept it throughout most of the last half of the game. But man, every now and again I keep going back and I'm like, what if I changed this up? And what if I changed this lightsaber shape? What if I changed the angle of the vents on the crossguard? Like, the detail in the customization in Jedi Survivor is ridiculous, and I think it is one of its best features for sure. The game obviously has quite a bit of content for you to do. Even if you finish the main story, there's the bounty hunters that you get to do. There's different rumors and side quests on Koboh and other planets that you can do. Tons of collectibles, force tears, challenges, all these different things to keep gameplay feeling fresh, and like there's plenty to do in the world of Jedi Survivor. Obviously, now completing the story, I've unlocked New Game Plus, and at some stage I will probably go back and play the story again, maybe on a higher difficulty. And satisfyingly enough, the game gives you perks when you finish the story for New Game Plus to make it a different experience. It changes up the encounters, it makes it harder, and all this stuff, just so it does feel like a different experience, so you're not just playing the same game but on a harder difficulty, which I thought was a nice touch. And obviously these perks are optional, just like any other perk in the game. These just affect the New Game Plus journey. But obviously Jedi Survivor had its issues when it comes to performance. I was lucky enough that on my computer I didn't have too many issues. I had the occasional frame drop and visual glitch on day one. I know for my partner's computer, hers really struggled to play the game, even though hers is not too different from mine. What was the more common experience for a lot of people on PC, where the game was running pretty slow, loading screens were either long, there was crashes, there was frame drops, you know, tons of performance issues, to the point where for a good while Jedi Survivor had mostly negative reviews on Steam, which is so unfortunate because the game is top tier. Again, I was lucky enough to not run into a lot of these performance issues, thank God, but I know a lot of people did, and that is so unfortunate. It's becoming more and more common these days for games to just be released in a bit of a mess on day one. Not sure what's causing this, whether it's crunch time or just devs being pushed to release something on a certain date instead of delaying it. Again, we're seeing more delays in the game industry. Cyberpunk a couple years ago, and we're seeing it again with a few other games. Hopefully something gets sorted to the point where we don't run into these issues, because a lot of these games are really good, and Jedi Survivor is a prime example of that, where the game is so good but there's just performance issues that make people not want to play it, and eventually they'll just lose interest and then not play it at all. Patches have been released since to try and fix a lot of these issues on console and PC, and I definitely have noticed an improvement on performance, even though I wasn't running into a lot lot of issues. I definitely noticed the game running a lot better on my system, and it has been running a lot better on some other systems. There's obviously still a long way to go, but hopefully they get to the bottom of this and they make the game a lot more stable than it is now. I will say too, just some of my favorite things from the game. Obviously we've talked about customization, but a lot of the enemy types as well. I found it satisfying to have a lot of Clone Wars era stuff in the game, whether it be items in the world or enemy types like fighting B1s and B2s, Magna Guards, Droidicas. All of that stuff was actually really satisfying. Obviously you're fighting the Empire, you're fighting bounty hunters as well, which isn't too dissimilar from Fallen Order, but there was enough here where I think the enemy variety made it quite refreshing, and you got used to every enemy type. I mean, seriously, yeah, the Clone Wars stuff was like some of my favorite stuff to fight. BX Commando droids as well, just really fun to fight, really cool to see back in Star Wars, especially in this sort of era where they're being repurposed for different means. Obviously having 5 combat stances to choose from was a good variety to keep the game fresh. A lot of the game I played with the single bladed stance just because that's what I prefer in general when it comes to Jedi. I prefer them to have the single blade lightsaber, and gameplay wise it was definitely the better choice for me. I found myself having an easier time and a more fun time playing with a single blade, but dual wield was a close second. That stance is actually a lot of fun. The fluid combat, fast paced, a lot of ways to play differently with that. I tried out double bladed as well. That's been elevated since the last game. Some of the move sets look absolutely astonishing in the double blade stance, and obviously bringing in 2 new ones with the blaster stance and the crossguard stance, both of which are very good. I haven't played too much with them, so I can't comment on them too much, but the little I did play with them, I found them to be also satisfying. So every stance has its own feel to it, and definitely feels like you can do multiple run-throughs of this game with either one of those, just using one. Obviously you can only have 2 equipped at any given time, and some are definitely better for different scenarios, but there's nothing stopping you from just completing the game with only one of those stances, whatever your preference is. Overall, I think Jedi Survivor is a pretty complete package. They've definitely learnt a lot from Jedi Fallen Order of what they could have improved on, different elements of the story they could improve on, how to elevate and bring it to that next level, and I think they've achieved that in Jedi Survivor. Overall, the experience was a fantastic one. Even though I finished the story, there are some moments where I just can't put down the game because the gameplay is just so much fun. It's very addicting. There's plenty to do in the game. There's plenty that I haven't actually seen. I remember finishing the story, looking at my save file, and it said I only had 55% of the game done. So I think I'll give Jedi Survivor an 8 out of 10. This definitely could have been a 9.5 out of 10, I reckon, but just due to some of the underwhelming story elements and the performance issues on day 1 especially, it's going to have to bring down the score a little bit. But scores are arbitrary. They can change. My opinion might change on different elements of the game. Maybe on a second run through I'll find those story elements that I found underwhelming on the first run actually more satisfying when it comes to another run. And I think Jedi Survivor for any Star Wars fan is a must buy and a must play. Even if you're not a Star Wars fan, you like that Souls-like challenging combat and that kind of challenge of a game, Jedi Survivor is definitely the game for you, and genuinely beyond what Fallen Order was. So very satisfied with the experience of Jedi Survivor. And I'd love to hear what you think of the game so far. If you finished it, if you haven't finished it, where you're up to, what have you found to be the most satisfying part of Jedi Survivor? I'd love to hear down below in the comments. Let me know what you thought of the game. I'll try to do some more Jedi Survivor content if and when I can, and hopefully you guys enjoyed my review of Jedi Survivor. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.